Welcome to the Conversation Lab. I'm Don Schaefer. If democracy begins in conversation, then we need to nurture a culture where ordinary people like us routinely talk about those things that help us understand each other, whether it's about climate, race, religion, gender, or politics. When we're trying to make sense of our city and the world we live in, every question comes with a set of assumptions about the nature of ourselves and our place in a larger world. The Conversation Lab provides a safe place to talk about some of those things. This program is produced by CFRO-FM in Vancouver. It's available on air and online on various platforms, and we appreciate the help of Vancouver's community groups. David-Whyte is an English poet now living in the Pacific Northwest. He's an author, a lecturer, among many other things, the author of 8 books of poetry and 4 books of prose. Thanks to Jacques Cousteau, perhaps in part anyway, David holds a degree in marine zoology and has traveled extensively, including living and working as a naturalist guide in the Galapagos Islands and leading expeditions in the Andes, Amazon, Himalayas, and recently Europe. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to our studios.
Pleasure to be here, too.
Did I get most of the facts right?
It's interesting to be called an English poet. My mother was Irish, so I'm half Irish, half English, and I more identify with Yorkshire in the north and Ireland. But these are interesting names. I often think that one of the great disciplines of human life is naming something such that it's actually able to stay alive and not be imprisoned by it. So I have great difficulty naming myself, actually. I come from so many different inheritances and streams, yes.
Do you find it interesting to hear about, is that me when you hear all those different things happen?
I do, and when I see a table full of books and CDs, and I think if you live at the frontier of your life, you're constantly astonished at what has occurred previously. And as one matures, the way our relationship to time changes. All the different times are happening at once, and they're also happening to someone who isn't alive anymore. So it's almost as if one's entering a kind of dream time. But I think, the distortions that occur with notoriety and fame can be quite difficult, and it's best to take them all with a pinch of salt, and then when you're asked specific questions, to answer them. And you've probably got a few specific questions.
Yeah, I have a few, but I don't know how many we'll get to.
Yes.
As I was preparing for this interview, I found it interesting that in many ways I feel that I know you better than some of my friends, and I don't know what that says about me or about them.
Yes.
Through your CDs, your poetry, and your live events, you've shared some wonderful stories about your parents, your closest friends. You've shared highlights and the peaks and valleys of your life.
Yeah.
So I've gotten to know you a lot better and me in that process. Is there ever any risk of putting yourself always out there so much?
Well, I think the art of poetry keeps one safe in a way, because you can't write good poetry and just be confessional or just be indulgent about your own difficulties and pains. You have to be speaking for everyone else's pain and grief and difficulty, but also their courageous ways into the next invisible step in their life. So I find that the discipline of poetry itself keeps you on safe foundational ground. Good poetry always puts you into a conversation that is larger than your own. So it's never just me, and it's never just thee. It's always this meeting between what you think is you and what you think is not you, or what you think is present now and what's about to happen in the future. So every human being is standing on some kind of invitational frontier where they're being asked to articulate the next invitation in their life, knowing that we're standing on a new era, a new dispensation. And it takes courage not to want to turn your face away and create your own abstract little bubble. And I've always felt poetry is the art of overhearing yourself say things you didn't want to know. Thank you very much. It's the art of creating language against which there are no defenses. So you come to ground through your language, but in that coming to ground, you create actually a new horizon. It's not a static solidity, but this relationship to this beckoning future.
Is that more like turning into the light, being more vulnerable, being more open, being more exposed?
Yeah, it's interesting to use the word vulnerability, because we tend to have an inherited understanding of vulnerability as a weakness. But if you think about it, vulnerability is the de facto state of every human being. Vulnerability means that you are subject to powers larger than your own. And it's interesting to think of vulnerability actually as a faculty, as a way of actually being in the world. When you think about it, every real conversation always follows an axis of vulnerability, AXIS. It follows a line of vulnerability. And when the vulnerability stops, the real conversation stops. That's true in a marriage or relationship.
In everything.
I'd say so, yes. And I mean, in a workplace, for instance, in a leadership conversation, the vulnerability is me as a boss not having all the answers. So if I can actually embody that not knowing and invite other people to help me see and figure out what's occurring. So yes, vulnerability is a practice of paying radical attention. When I first got out to the Galapagos Islands as a young scientist, and it's an old joke, but I got to those islands and I found that none of the animals had read any of the zoology books that I had read. And they insisted on having lives of their own. And the place terrified me, actually.
Imagine your surprise.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. I had to put aside everything I'd learned as a scientist in order to become a good scientist, actually, in order to pay real attention. And it was in Galapagos where I first began to understand that, our identity doesn't actually depend on our personal beliefs. The least interesting thing about a person is what they believe. But our identity depends on how much attention we're paying to the world, paying to things that are other than us, to create this life frontier with the world around us. Galapagos was certainly a remarkable and miraculous teacher in that way, and started the foundation in my adult life for real philosophical and poetic inquiry, I'd say.
Was it just the story that Jacques Cousteau kind of put you on that path?
Yes. I mean, I've written poetry since I was little, probably influenced by my Irish mother. And art subjects were always my best subjects. But when I was 13 or 14, I saw Jacques Cousteau sailing across our little black and white television set in the north of England. And I couldn't believe that there was work like this in the world, that you could actually live on a ship, follow the life of the dolphin, and be paid for it, And it was such a remarkable invitation that I gave up all my arts subjects, which you had to when you were about 15, choose between arts and sciences in the British system at that time. And I put myself into the salt mines of biology, chemistry, and physics, and then emerged with a degree in marine zoology. And it was because of that single image. Many of us have a moment. Sometimes it's written in gold, like that moment was for me. And other times it's subtly, in a way you suddenly find yourself making a promise or even a vow, and then you're entering this astonishing gravitational field of possible fulfillment and possible heartbreaking disappointment all at the same time. So the ability to follow a voice, a vocation, an image, this is a discipline of poetry, but it's also a discipline that finds a home, in every ordinary human life.
I'm struck by the amount of traveling you do, and I guess that's where it started.
Partly, I'd already been a rock climber and mountaineer, and I traveled all over Britain and Scotland and Wales rock climbing, and then I would go to the Alps. And then I was traveling, playing my fiddle around the streets of Europe and various things. And then I was off in Galapagos, and that led to travels in South America, and then that gave me a hunger for traveling in the Himalayas. And now my work and vocation has me on aeroplanes around the world, speaking in different places. So it does seem to be a definite theme of my life.
I have a schedule somewhere nearby, and it looks like a tour guide for a rock band. How do your kids feel about do they feel like they have a rock star dad?
Well, as they grew, they're now, I have a daughter at 18. She's now in South Africa on a game tracking course as part of her gap year before she goes to the University of Victoria next year. And I have a son who's 30. They had a slowly growing awareness into their father's notoriety and being known. And there's several funny and very heartbreaking moments as they became aware of this.
Do you want to share any of those?
The most heartbreaking one was when my son was sat disconsolately on my suitcase just before I was leaving the door. And he said, "Papa, you like to cook, don't you? You like to cook." I said, "I love to cook, yeah." And he said, "Papa, why don't you get a job down at Mike's place," which is the local was the local cafe in our town. And then I could come down and have breakfast with you every morning. And just about...
And you could stay home?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so I've often spoken to him afterwards because he has accompanied me to many wonderful exotic places around the world, and he's had a life traveling to Ireland and Britain, as he's grown up. And I check in with him and say, do you still wish that I'd got a job at Mike's place? And he says, no, Papa, you're all right.
It's still an awful tug of war.
It is, yeah. So I think, part of my work is about what I call the conversational nature of reality. And so as a parent, you've got to keep the conversation alive, and they've got to know that you want to keep the conversation alive. There are so many people whose jobs are such high pressure and high stress today, or that take them away. But as long as you're in a heartfelt way, really visiting with your child at a foundational level, and they know that you really want to keep the conversation alive and have repeated acts and testaments to that, I think it's really possible to be a good parent. Yeah.
To have that conversation, you have to be able to ask the right questions. And you've talked often about the right questions to ask. I think at one point there was a 10-point framing of the most important questions that have no right to go away. And at some point, Brother David fit into that discussion?
Yes, I can't remember. Those 10 points were written for Oprah magazine, and I can't remember what the 10 points were.
Do I know how to have a real conversation? What can I be wholeheartedly about? Am I harvesting from this year's season of life? And it goes on. But it was an interesting list.
Yes, there are subsets of this. Yeah. The subsets of what I call the art of asking the beautiful question. To my mind, beautiful questions are questions that shape your identity as much by asking them as by having them answered in any specific way. They will be answered specifically, I think, but for great seasons of our life, we're just meant to ask a question that will shape our identity into the future. And one beautiful question, of course, with regard to children is, how can I be a good father? How can I be a good mother? And to sincerely ask that question actually shapes your identity in very fierce ways. I remember with my son, I felt like I knew in an inherited way how to be a good father to a son. Yeah. When my daughter came along, I felt completely clueless. I did not know how to be a good father to my daughter. But all of my images of how I would be a good father to my daughter were based on the way I'd been a good father to my son. So it was really interesting to continually ask that question in a fierce way. And a real breakthrough moment was when she was 11 years old or so. And I suddenly realized that I wasn't supposed to be teaching my daughter, actually. As a man, I was supposed to be learning from this incarnation of the feminine in my life, that actually the way I would be a good father would be to apprentice myself to my daughter and to have her show me how she saw the world. Yeah.
What a wonderful gift.
Yeah, well, it was a wonderful inversion and gift. I remember laughing out loud when I realized it.
When it came to you.
Yeah, exactly. You think you're asking the real question, but actually you're not, But
I find that happens a lot lately.
The inversion.
Yeah, where I'm learning lots.
Exactly. There's a marvelous moment in William Wordsworth, the moment where he dedicates his life to his future as a poet. He's walking at dawn in the Lake District, and it's so stunningly beautiful, it overwhelms all his senses, and he says, I made no vows, but vows were then made for me. Bond unknown to me was given, that I should be, else sinning greatly, a dedicated spirit. And on I walked in blissfulness, which even yet remains. Yeah. So this beautiful line, I made no vows, but vows were then made for me. We're constantly making promises as part of much larger vows, and then constantly finding that our articulation of the promise, or the season of our life in which we made the promise, gave it a certain coloration and flavoring and life, but it's a life that always comes to an end. And human beings are constantly having to break promises in order to get back to the original vow, of which the temporary promise was just an articulation. So this art of promising, breaking promises, going back to the original vow, coming back to ground, finding